Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India.
Well, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? There is no country on earth that is more diverse than India. It's not the side of the bigger army that wins. It's the country that tells a better story.
Welcome to Sri Lanka, Dr. Tharoor. So I'm going to start with the questions. A diplomat, an author, a celebrity, a Twitterati, a politician. So which is the real Dr. Shashi Tharoor?
All of the above, I hope. I mean, I see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world, some of which I manifest in my writing, some of which I manifest in my speaking, some of which I manifest in my work. The work has varied because I began, as Mr. Menon pointed out, at the UN and then have ended up in politics. But it's the same person throughout. The desire to both respond to the world through my analysis of it, my comments on it, my writings on it, that's always been there right from my childhood. And at the same time, the desire to do something about it in tangible terms has always been there. So in my student days, I wrote, but I was also elected president of the Students' Union. In my in my early UN career with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, I actually, apart from doing a lot of very interesting work, which I was privileged to do, I was also elected the president of the UNHCR staff. So I always had this willingness to put myself out there in pursuance of causes I felt worthwhile. And at the end of all of that, here I am in politics, trying to make a difference in our country. And that's something which is deliberately phrased that way because it's the best one can hope for sometimes, is that the difference be tangible, however small it may be. Though obviously the aspiration to make a big difference is always ever present.
So if you go back to when you were 6 and you started writing, it's astonishing that you actually had your first article published when you were 10. And also...
It was a short story, actually.
Okay, yeah, and I think it was serialized, if I'm not mistaken.
No, that one was just a short story by itself, but very shortly thereafter, before my 11th birthday,
yeah,
I had what I fondly thought of as a novel, but which I guess was too short to even be a novella, serialized in 6 installments in a magazine just before my 11th birthday.
But what's interesting is that you made a choice as a student to pursue history. By all accounts, you were an excellent student yourself, and you could have done any subject you wanted to, but you chose history. And from what I also understand from some of the research I did, you chose history and you chose academics because your parents told you that writing didn't have any money in it. So I'm very curious. I'm very curious to know how did you think that there would be money in history, and why did you choose history as a topic?
No, let me explain. The first part is, yeah, my parents basically saw my writing and encouraged it. My father, to his great credit, would type up my stories and have them in a form that could be shared with friends and so on, and that gave me an early sense of belief in myself as a writer, as somebody who could write something that other people would want to read. So after all, the definition of a writer must include somebody who has readers. But at the same time, when they realized how seriously I was taking it and how involved I was in it, they cautioned me that this was not a viable profession.
Sure.
And indeed, at the time that I was growing up in India in the 60s, there was only one full-time writer in the entire country, and that was R.K. Narayan. Otherwise, and that he published his own books because he felt there was not enough money if he gave his books to a publisher to publish.
Sure.
So for somebody who wasn't yet R.K. Narayan, one had to be able to think seriously. And I was also extremely or inconveniently good at taking exams. So I had this inconvenient habit of coming first and everything all the time. My parents said, this is what you should concentrate on, write on the side, but work away at your studies. And so I did that because in any case, I have to admit, I did have a talent for it. I could remember things in time to regurgitate them in the examinations, which is what the teachers wanted, of course. Sadly, we can have a different conversation about the education system. But anyway, when it came to streaming in class 9, I asked for humanities. And my teachers were so upset, they called my parents to the school. And they objected rather violently, saying, this is our best science student. He's come first in science throughout. Why does he want to do humanities?
Sure.
So they turned to me and said, why? They had all these middle-class fantasies of producing a doctor or an engineer in the family. And there I was going to go off into humanities. So I said, the fact is I don't like the subject at all. I'm just good at taking the exam, but I forget everything I've studied for the science exam the day after I've taken the exam. Whereas if you ask me about history or about literature, I can respond with knowledge and passion and insight. So they said, all right, do what you like. And I did humanities. Again, I did very well in the exams, and I came first in the state, which de facto also meant first in the country. And at the end of that, I could have got into a more fashionable humanities subject, namely economics. And that's what my parents assumed I would do, since all the quote-unquote smart humanities students were doing that. I said, no, I want to do history. And again, the same conversation. So I said, look, this is what interests me. In fact, St. Stephen's College that I applied to was so shocked to get my application for history that they gave me admission without an interview, which I believe has never happened since. But the reason was that people with those marks weren't applying to study history. They were all going to economics. And then when I finished that and did rather well in the exams as well, my parents said, look, you've done all the wrong things, at least take the IIM examinations, just in case. So I did, and the sort of luck with examinations continued, and I came first. There were only 2 IIMs in the country in those days. So I came first in IIM Calcutta and second in IIM Ahmedabad on the admissions list. But meanwhile, a scholarship came through to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy to study international politics. So again, I said to my parents, I'd rather do that. And the end of that was I was blessed with very understanding parents. What can I say?
Sure.
Many kids, even today, are complaining about having had to do things to appease their parents that they might not really have wanted to do. But that was something my parents never burdened me with. So I followed my own passion. When I went to Fletcher, actually, it was a move away from history because it was international affairs, international politics that I worked on. But the important thing was that I was throughout able to follow my intellectual interests. And it happened to lie in that field. Why that field? I don't know. Maybe history was like, listening to or reading a lot of stories. But I was a kind of crazy kid who, in class 10, for example, I maintained an entire notebook of essays I wrote for myself that were not required by the school, that were never seen by a teacher, corrected by a teacher, and that obliged me to do additional reading beyond the school books, merely because the subject excited me so much.
Just to understand that point a little better, so history was a passion. You didn't have a goal in mind saying, I'm going to do history and it's going to take me somewhere.
No. In fact, I didn't know what I would do with it.
Yes.
In fact, if anything, the sort of half-articulated expectation was I would take the IAS, IFS examinations, because this business of being, especially in India, the 60s, early 70s, taking examinations was the way forward to everything.
Sure.
Whatever you wanted to do in life. And since that was something I was good at, my parents weren't too worried because they figured out that, at the end of the day, if this is what he wants to do, join the services, he can do it. History will not be a disqualification.
Sure.
Those days it wasn't. Today, I think the quantitative subjects are getting many more of the civil service toppers. In those days, that wasn't the case. And I can say with some immodesty that it was widely assumed in my university, my college as well, that I would have no difficulty acing that. But when I got the scholarship to go abroad, I said, let me try and expand my own horizons. In those days, of course, for those of you who are too young to know, but your parents may have told you, it was extremely unusual to be able to travel abroad. You were given the princely sum of $8 in foreign exchange because that's all you had. You had to fend for yourself. It was quite an adventure. And it was a way of seeing something which perhaps otherwise I might not be able to see. So off I went, and it so happened that the time of my departure coincided with the emergency. And that became a rather disillusioning moment to contemplate government service. So I never did take the IAS, IFS exams, but that could have been a sort of option.
Sure.
Had I sought to exercise it.
I want you to see a small little video which I want to show you some quote that you've given.
Got more, my gosh, I'm impressed. It's important for us to remember history. First of all, young people should always know, just as you want to know about your parents, your grandparents, what their background was. Similarly, as a civilization, we need to know what happened in our past. And I believe that it's for the past. We have to embrace the past for what it is. We have to confront the past in the past. I'm not in favor of using history to bash people on the head today, as some people like to do. It's not about that. And it's certainly my book, An Era of Darkness, is actually a pretty devastating critique of how the British ruled in India for 200 years, but it doesn't actually have any prescriptions for today's relationship with Britain, which, as far as I'm concerned, is between two sovereign equal countries. They no longer are colonial overlords. I don't have any hang-ups about that anymore. But my view is, face history, know history, leave it in the past. But the important thing, it seems to me, is that you really, if you don't know where you're coming from, you can't appreciate where you're going. And that's important for all of us to know. We should know our history. We should certainly forgive wrongs that were done in the past, but we should never forget.
So I have a moot question in that context. As a history student, whose version of history should we believe in? Because there are so many versions floating around in terms of history, and since you're a passionate historian yourself and you studied history, I thought it's meaningful to ask you that question in today's context, because we learned how respected our founding fathers were of the nation. Today, I don't know if someone's learning history whether they're going to be taught that anymore.
Well, we all believe the history we want to believe, unfortunately, in the sense that because the facts are there, how you interpret them depends very much on your subjectivity. What bothers me is when some of these interpretations are actually based on false facts. Just as we're now seeing fake news, people who get little snippets on WhatsApp and on the internet are being fed a diet of falsehoods. Everything from something Macaulay is supposed to have said about how wonderfully honest and upright Indians were in 1835, which Macaulay never said, completely fake, to alleged stories of Nehru's Muslim parentage and so on, also completely fake. There's a lot of the stuff going around. So you do need to develop the discernment to understand what is real and what is fake. And now, given that a lot of the material is available, we really have no excuse but to read reputable sources. Then we can come to different conclusions. I mean, as I've said in relation to my own book, the one we're just talking about in that interview, my argument is based on facts. Every single thing is meticulously end-noted. So the narrative reads smoothly, but if you really want to check where did this fellow get this from, you can go right to the end of the book. There are almost 25, 30 pages of notes substantiating everything that I've said. So facts are sacred, opinions are your own, and others can find other facts that I have chosen to omit or not emphasize, and they could then proceed to come up with different opinions, and they're entitled to do so, as long as it's based on verified.
How does one really come to know whether the facts they are really
I think by reading reputable sources. If all you have is something that people are making up and sending you on WhatsApp, insist on checking. Insist on checking. And the irony is, people will even have fake. Just yesterday or the day before, a friend of mine who's a historian forwarded me something. And the person who had forwarded it to her claimed it was from Collins and Lapierre's Freedom at Midnight. Except that I've read Collins and Lapierre's Freedom at Midnight, and that particular thing that's going around the internet is simply not from there. So, okay, if everyone says, well, we don't have the time to go back to original sources, then please at least hold your opinions with due regard for the fact that you may actually be wrong in what you're basing them on. Or listen to those who have taken the trouble to go back to the original sources. Ideally, read reputable writers, historians, and others, and then come up with your own points.
So I have a friend in school who barely passed. He's probably the opposite of what you were. But in today's world on the internet, he's a guru on history. He sends out lots of these huge, facts, which, historical facts. So I find that quite strange, and I find people lapping it up hungrily based on a point of view, which is why I thought it's a moot question to ask at this point in time.
There is a hunger for these things, and it's quite startling because my number, unfortunately for me, is in the public domain. So I get flooded with WhatsApps every day, and I can't read 90% of them because over 1,000 come in a day, mainly from strangers. But once in a while, inevitably, one is distracted and you see the kinds of things that are being said and passed around, and sometimes it's quite alarming. Sometimes it's instructive.
Yes.
Especially when it deals with contemporary events, there are lots of fabulous little anecdotes and stories which move me like they're meant to move me. But it's when the history stuff comes around and I know what they're talking about that I sometimes feel a bit put off.
Sure. On to the next question related to your books. I believe you were an asthmatic child, and that meant that you spent a lot of time indoors at home. And you once set yourself a target of reading 365 books in 365 days, and actually you did that. So it's quite interesting that your passion for writing seems to have been fueled somewhere also by your passion for reading.
Very much so, Mr. Menon. In fact, I will tell you that it's a course of action I have refused to recommend to anybody since. And if anyone expresses admiration for my having done that, I always tell them it was a crazy thing to do, don't do it. Read for pleasure, don't read to a deadline or to a task. But it was just one of these perverse things. Somehow this crazy idea came into my head, I'm going to read 365 books this year. I actually read more because I finished the 365 before Christmas, I remember. but it involved a lot of almost speed reading, reading very fast just in order to finish. It meant deliberately choosing short books sometimes. It was not the year that I read Gone with the Wind, for example. But at the same time, let me say that reading has a tremendously useful impact on children. So all of you who are parents should very much encourage your children to read without being too prescriptive about what they read. If they get into the habit of reading anything, then they will eventually use that technique to read worthwhile things. Again, I was blessed in my parents. I read good books and junk with equal energy, and my parents never stopped me. In fact, I used to enjoy reading comics, and not just Amar Chitra Katha, even Archie and all of those. And no one ever told me this is bad, this is childish stuff, don't do it. So till age of 11 or 12, and then very naturally one grows out of it. Whereas if you deny children these things, they may never acquire the habit. But I did read that particular year a lot of stuff without fully enjoying it, simply because there was no time to go back and savor a sentence or appreciate a description or absorb a fact. It was, I've got to finish this and notch up one more notch in my list, which I think is a bad way of reading. So never do it again. And when my kids heard about this, I said, please don't imitate me. In fact, a lot of my kids' successes in life, I think, come from having done the opposite of the way their father led the same years of his life.
So, coming to your books, obviously there's a book right now which is Era of Darkness or Inglorious Empire, which is setting the internet on fire. And it's a very interesting, relevant topic, and I got a lot of questions on WhatsApp from the ICF members related to that topic. But I want to first show you a bit of a funny video. As a prelude to the questions, and I'm sure it'll entertain everyone. So can we have the video, please?
In recent years, many in India have called for colonial reparations, with one particular demand recently gaining attention.
This is the Kohinoor diamond, which reached Britain during the reign of the British Empire and became the magnificence of the Queen's crown. A lobby of Indian industrialists and artists in London are preparing to give legal challenge to Queen Elizabeth for Kohinoor's return to India.
Yes, some in India are demanding the return of the fabled Kohinoor diamond, which was removed from India and presented to Queen Victoria in 1850 before being embedded in this elegant head sofa. But the British government is refusing to give that diamond up for reasons that former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg explained last year.
There is no doubt in our mind that the diamond was relocated to this country under legal conditions which are not in any doubt. But there is, I think, clarity in the sincerity with which the Queen holds the crown jewels, all of them, in trust on behalf of the nation, has done for many generations, and future monarchs will continue to do so.
OK. That's an intricate legal argument, so let me see if I can break it down for you. What he's basically saying is, I understand that you want the diamond, but the thing is, we have the diamond, you don't, and we're going to keep having it forever. So in summary, finders keepers, go fuck yourself, cheerio. And as for the current Prime Minister, David Cameron, when he was asked about returning the diamond during a visit to India a few years ago, he simply stated, "They're not having that back." Which is so petulant and childish a response. I'm surprised he didn't lick the diamond to call official dibs on it. And look, in a way, you can understand why Britain does not want to give that diamond back. All our greatest possessions are stolen. Tea, stolen. The Elgin marbles, let's say permanently borrowed. The entire British Museum is basically an active crime scene. And if we start giving back everything we took from the Empire, that building will basically be completely empty, except for one portrait of Lord Alfred Tennyson and a pair of Gary Oldman's old running shorts. And that can't happen.
So, I mean...
John Oliver is brilliant.
He's brilliant, isn't he? So, I mean, what do you expect? What would be your best case scenario in terms of expectation on the basis of what you've just written? Would you want the British to actually start paying a reparation? Would that be a great outcome? Would you want the people of India to become aware that actually this was not a benevolent colonialist, but in reality they were thugs? Or is it that you want, some kind of an apology from the British government saying, you know what, we did bad, sorry, let's forget about it? What is your best case outcome in terms of what you want from the book?
Okay, well, since you raised the Kohinoor, I'll say on the Kohinoor, I don't expect to get it back. In fact, I've said in the book that maybe just it's sitting there on the Queen Mother's tiara in the Tower of London, where it emphatically does not belong, is the most striking evidence of the theft, loot, and expropriation that colonialism is really all about. So let it stay there as a reminder of the active crime scene, as John Oliver called it. Now, coming back to your larger question, to my mind, reparations are not a serious proposition. Above all, from our side, because how can you put a value on the human lives that were lost because of British rule? How can we put a value on the 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessary deaths in British-made famines because of British policies and British decisions? How do you put a value on the destruction, the damage, the daily, every year throughout the 18th century and the 19th century? In those days' money, between 18 and 50 million pounds were repatriated, quote unquote, to England from India. There were thefts of entire treasuries emptied. There were fortunes made. I mean, for example, the governor of Madras in 1702, Thomas Pitt, stole a diamond known as the Pitt diamond, which established the basis of his entire fortune. He bought an entire manor and a rotten borough from it. He became a member of parliament because in those days you could buy a seat in parliament. And he founded a dynasty that went on to produce two British prime ministers, William Pitt the Elder, the Earl of Chatham, and William Pitt the Younger. So given all of this vast amount of loot, if you start calculating, A, you can't calculate because of the lives involved, but B, even if you did calculate, the number would be so astronomical, it would be unpayable. In fact, an Indian journalist, after my Oxford speech, actually did make a calculation, came up with 3 or 4 trillion pounds sterling, which is more than the entire British GDP. So it's not payable. Any sum that is credible is not payable, and any sum that is payable is not credible, so why go in for reparations? Rather, what I would seek is atonement. And atonement, in my view, can take two forms. One, the easier one, I think, is for the British to just teach colonial history in their schools. They just don't do it. It's completely brushed under the carpet. There's a deliberate historical amnesia. All the Brits know about empire are these gauzy, romanticized television soap operas showing the glamorous sort of side of empire. Nothing about the horrors whatsoever. It's just completely forgotten. In fact, by coincidence, the week that my book came out in India, an article appeared by a Pakistani journalist in The Guardian who'd raised 2 children in one of the best schools in England, and they had both done A-levels in history, and neither had learned a word of colonial history. So that's the first and easier task for the British. The second task, to my mind, maybe it's more difficult, but it's really necessary, is an apology. And the purpose of that apology is to cleanse the sin. I'll give you what I have been arguing for, though I don't do it explicitly in the book. I've talked about it ever since. If you look at the fact that there were many, many atrocities. In 1858 in Delhi, they butchered a lakh of people. 100,000 Indians were killed by the British in reprisals after the mutiny. We'll forget all of that. Take one episode, Jallianwala Bagh, April 13, 1919, which in my view stands to represent the worst of everything to do with the British Raj. Why? Because I'll tell you the story of Jallianwala Bagh. It'll take 5 minutes, but it's worth knowing. The British had enjoyed Indian support during the First World War. Mahatma Gandhi had called on India to support the First World War. We sent everything, money, valuables, food, clothing, medicines, vehicles, human beings. 1.3 million Indian soldiers fought in the war. Even rail lines were ripped out of the ground and sent off to aid the war effort. The British fought the First World War essentially on Indian backs. The equivalent in today's money of about 80 billion pounds sterling was spent by India. At a time when the country was poor, was reeling under wartime inflation, and was also the worst victim of the Spanish flu epidemic that was sweeping the world. Despite all that, India supported the war, principally out of the hope that Britain would fulfill its promise to give India responsible self-government after the war. Needless to say, the British broke their word. Perfidious Albion lied, and at the end of the war, instead of granting India self-government, they actually imposed the draconian Rowlatt Acts, which actually were a way of reimposing wartime emergency restrictions on Indians who are obviously protesting the lack of freedoms in the country. At that point, a number of protests broke out, and particularly Punjab was aflame. General Dyer, Brigadier General Dyer, was sent to Amritsar to impose martial law on the city, which he did. And he proclaimed something that we know in India as Section 144, that more than 5 people couldn't assemble at one time. Unfortunately, a number of people from the surrounding countryside, peasants, families, not protesters, they were not even aware that there was this Section 144 in force, gathered in a place called Jallianwala Bagh to commemorate Baisakhi. It was the Baisakhi festival. So what did Dyer do? He shows up with his soldiers, does not shout any orders to disperse, doesn't issue any warnings, doesn't even fire a warning shot in the air. He orders his soldiers coldly, clinically to open fire on the defenseless, unarmed men, women and children. There's only one gate out of Jallianwala Bagh. It's a walled garden. So as they head towards the gate, the soldiers are waiting at the gate to shoot them. It was such an inhumane act that I think they used 1,650 bullets or something, and they killed 1,379 right with those bullets, and the rest were all severely injured. It was just a complete turkey shoot. At the end of that, Dyer refused to let anybody tend to the dead, the dying, and the wounded for 24 hours. They lay in the hot sun, moaning and crying, while their relatives stood outside the gates, piteously unable to help them. He imposed various other restrictions that I've described in my book, horrendous, horrendous behavior. At the end of it all, he ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a particular street where an English missionary had been said to be assaulted. She was also rescued by Indians, so that was irrelevant to him. And if they so much as lifted their head while crawling, they were hit on the head by British staves. Dyer did all of this. Inevitably, there were howls of protest. The Congress conducted an inquiry. All sorts of things happened. The House of Commons condemned Dyer for his behavior, but the House of Lords passed a resolution honoring Dyer for what he had done, and the British community in India raised money to reward him. And whipped on by some British newspapers, the equivalent of, in today's money, of £250,000 sterling were raised. They were presented to him with a bejeweled sword. And this fellow was called by Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, as the man who saved India. This was so to me, it was everything. The betrayal to begin with of promises made and not kept, the brutality and cruelty, the murderous cruelty, the indifference to Indian suffering that followed the act of killing, the humiliation and racism that accompanied it, and then the vindication and self-justification and the reward to the man who had perpetrated. All of this put together makes Jallianwala Bagh the single worst atrocity of the empire. And to my mind, therefore, if on the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh, if on April 13, 2019, a member of the royal family ideally, because everything was done in the name of the crown, or the British Prime Minister, which I realize is unlikely, were to come to Amritsar and to kneel and beg forgiveness for that horrendous atrocity, and by extension all the other atrocities of 200 years of British rule, then it seems to me there would have been a real atonement, a real cleansing of the sin. That's what I want.
Yeah.
I also want India to do something about it. I've suggested that the glorious Victoria Memorial in Calcutta be converted into a museum of colonial atrocities. So far, no reply from our allegedly nationalistic government, but I'm going to pursue it.
Coming to your books again, and small little visual of all your books. I mean, it's interesting. All of the books are about India.
Actually, they're not all there, but
in most of the books.
There are 16 books, 3 missing. But great, very impressed collection. Very impressed.
I mean, but I think if I cover all the books, it would still be predominantly about India.
They're all about India.
So my question really is, obviously there's a lot of passion with regards to India.
Very much so.
And that's one of the things that you keep writing about in all your books. Where is that coming from? In the sense, I think the other Indian leader who used to write books about India was, of course, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and the discovery of India, which is it's amazing and it's thrilling to read. Is it inspired from there? Is that where the inspiration is? And is it an intuitive, instinctive thing that you write about India, or is it a deliberate strategy saying, hey, I'm going to write about India and one day that's my way to fame and that's my way to the hearts of the Indian people? I mean, I'm curious to know.
I began writing about India, frankly, from childhood, because I was always very interested in what it meant to be an Indian, the forces that had made India and nearly unmade it. And I had a lot of curiosity about those things, which meant I was kind of scratching an intellectual itch about India throughout. A lot of my studies too, I enjoyed history, and in Delhi University you did a course in British history, you did a course in, we had a choice of American and Far East, I did American, all of that. But Indian history was always what really got me impassioned, particularly modern Indian history. So I did find all of that spoke to my own interests, and one finds it difficult to explain where one's interests come from. It certainly helped that when I was at the United Nations, there is, I sought official permission to write, because the UN has fairly strict staff rules, and I said, look, other people collect butterflies or go on hikes or run marathons in their spare time. I write, so I need permission. So I used to joke that I was the only UN official with a license to write. Like James Bond had a license to kill, I had a license to write. In fact, in those days, my books would have in the copyright page, if you look at an earlier edition, you'll see a little disclaimer saying, though the author is an official of the United Nations, none of the opinions expressed by the characters in this book are to be taken as those of the United Nations or of the author in his official capacity, which is a legal disclaimer that the UN wanted to see. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because you could not write anything as a UN official that offended member states, I figured out that the only member state it was safe to offend was my own, because we are a democracy, and that even if I wrote something nasty about India, the Indian government was hardly going to complain about me. And so that too was an additional motive, that if I wrote about India, it was fairly safe. If I wrote something about another country, that country could object. Or some officious UN official could object. Whereas on this I couldn't. So it was interesting. In fact, an op-ed I wrote on the 50th anniversary of India's independence in the New York Times actually elicited an official protest from the Pakistan High Commissioner, because he claimed that my description of Indian nationalism negated the legitimate aspirations of the Muslims of the subcontinent to their own homeland, and that therefore it was inadmissible for a UN official to write this. So Kofi Annan received the letter and he called me and said, I don't intend to reply. And he showed it to me, and out it went into the filing system. But the fact is that if even indirectly mentioning Pakistan meant that I could elicit a protest, it was just as well that I stuck to India.
Okay, moving on to another interest of yours, which is social media. And you've been an active, prolific social media propagator yourself. Small little video again.
on the one hand, the New York Times called me the Twitter king of India or something. And on the other hand, it got me into an awful lot of trouble with people who were still very resistant in our political establishment to this kind of transparentness and openness. Mind you, I turned out to be right, because everybody, including the current Prime Minister, followed my example, and they're doing very well on Twitter thereafter. And it's not just Twitter, it's Facebook, it's the entire phenomenon of social media being ways of reaching out to voters. And it's going to keep growing in a democracy like India's, because right now the internet penetration rate is inadequate. I mean, about 12% of the population have access to desktops or laptops or internet cafes. Another 18% are going onto the internet on their smartphones. So about 30% of the population is all we have going on the internet. But as smartphones become cheaper and more affordable, and we go from 3G to 4G and broadband connectivity even in our rural areas, so that the average poor person who currently has a phone that basically makes calls and doesn't do much net surfing, if that person is able to go on the internet, then you'll suddenly have 1 billion Indian people on social media. And believe me, that's going to be transformative of our democracy.
You know, I mean, the question I have is, I think the point you already raised a little bit earlier, fake news. And I think we've just had an example in the United States of America where arguably fake news has brought a president to power. Would you call that in some way a subversion of the democratic process? Because you've got something happening in social media where, based on certain false premises, a party and a ruler or a leader has come to power. And given that this is, you know, I think this interview of yours was a couple of years ago, and the internet penetration is actually quadrupled probably in India. I'm just exaggerating to make a point. But fact is that social media has become a very, very big, important form of communication. And we had our Prime Minister on Friday address all the members of his party and told them to all be actively involved in social media. Is there a real danger of something worse happening in India than it's already happening in terms of social media and its impact? Can we get fake news bringing in fake leaders?
We already have fake news all over social media in India, as we said earlier in our conversation. The Prime Minister certainly has taken this up to an art form. He's done a magnificent job of not only acquiring followers, but using the techniques of every available media. And not just modern social media, he even uses relatively old-fashioned media like radio with his monthly broadcasts. So I have a lot of respect for the way in which he has multiplied every way of entering people's consciousness to an extent that probably was not available to many of the earlier leaders. And undoubtedly, he's well on his way to becoming India's best-known political leader of all time, simply because everybody has some access or the other to something he said, something, you know, either they've heard him, they've read him, they've seen him, they've watched him, whatever it may be. And that is going to be a significant development. And I've been saying to my own party leadership that they have to shed their diffidence about appearing on media, because that is very much the way forward. And it is striking, when I joined government in 2009, government computers were actually barred from accessing social media. I couldn't go on my Twitter account or my Facebook from my government computer. I had to wait till I got home. And what was interesting about that is how far we've come to a point in which every minister, even if he or she were not inclined to do so, has been obliged by the Prime Minister to open an account. And they're all tweeting or having staff tweet for them and putting out messages all the time. And social media has also become an instrument of governance, where you're seeing, for example, people tweeting from their railway compartment saying, my father's just had a heart attack, and somebody in the railway ministry makes sure that by the next station there are doctors waiting, and this kind of thing has actually happened.
Sure.
Or Sushma Swaraj responding to people on Twitter who've lost their passports or are stuck in foreign countries or suffered some tragedy or accident elsewhere, and so on and so forth. All of this has shown you the transformation. I remember in 2009, again, October or so, when I was in the middle of all these Twitter controversies, giving an interview to a journalist, Harinder Babeja, then of Tehelka, in which I said that within 10 years, every serious politician would be on Twitter. I didn't realize I wouldn't have to wait 10 years.
Sure.
I mean, within 5 or 6, that has become absolutely widespread in India. what are the dangers? The dangers of fake news are always there. And when you get so much of unfiltered information, unless you are intellectually equipped to filter it through your own reading and awareness and discernment, or you decide that you will only trust certain sources and not others, then you're bound to get a certain amount of disinformation. One of the alarming things about this fake news phenomenon is the extent to which people believe things,
Yes.
sincerely perhaps,
Yes.
that are simply not true and act on it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, it transforms the sort of Madison Avenue thing that perception is the only reality. That it doesn't matter if something that you are told actually never happened.
Yeah.
As long as you believe it happened for you. And you can act on that basis, vote on that basis, choose your leaders.
Literally a virtual world.
That is very worrying.
Yeah.
On the positive side, of course, it does make it more difficult, it seems to me, to impose a dictatorship on our country. Because there will always be all these multiple sources of information far too proliferated to be curbed. And everybody will be, retailing all sorts of different versions of the same facts that the government wants you to believe. So hopefully you will be able to overcome the risk of just one view, one version, one story prevailing.
I'm not a proponent of curtailing freedoms, but I do think that, and I think I want your opinion on it more than anything, isn't it time to ask the Facebooks of the world who are cognizant of this in the context of what just happened in the US to actually, make some adjustments to how they operate to kind of filter out fake news? And I think there is a discussion going on that.
There is a discussion going on. Facebook has already said they'll try and do this, but there's some real problems. First of all, there are fact-checking sites now. The US has probably the world leader in fact-check sites, so we've got 2 or 3 in India as well. And strictly speaking, for every fact that is claimed, you could go and check on but it takes time and trouble, and very few people bother. I think in the US is factcheck.com, factcheck.org, I can't remember which one it is. And in India, there's factchecker.com. So these are fairly easy names to remember, and you can quickly go and check. On that basis, if somebody is retailing a lie, Facebook and so on could be able to take it off. But the problem is, does this mean we want Facebook to have the equivalent of China's internet police? China has something like 300,000 people whose full-time job is to scour the internet to take down subversive comments. So somebody writes something against the Communist Party in China in Chinese on a blog, the internet police will catch him and take it down and go after him. Whereas you don't really want Facebook doing that. First of all, it would take more than 300,000 people, because there are, God knows, 1 billion people on Facebook today. Sure. And they're each posting multiple times a day. So I don't even know if it's possible. You could, I suppose, have algorithms that will filter out the more prominent fake news stories. But I just don't think that, as I was saying earlier about dictatorship, I just don't think censorship is even technologically possible. Beyond a certain point, because it's too easy to bypass. I mean, there are countries, for example, like Saudi Arabia and others, which have got their own restrictions on the internet. China too, by the way, where you can only go on certain approved sites, and pornography is one thing that is often excluded. But everybody in Saudi Arabia wants to access pornography, goes through a different server, and they get it. In China, for example, I remember the last time I was there, which was about 2-3 years ago, for a conference. The interpreter assigned to me was a very bright young girl who was studying international relations. And she was very interested, because I was willing to say rather bold things, which is why I've never been invited to China again. And apparently the things I was saying were the talk of gossip amongst the interpreters, because they were so, quote unquote, courageous. And she writes to me on Gmail, except that Gmail is banned in China. Gmail is banned in China, and when I was trying to access my own mail, during the days I was in China, I had no way of accessing my email. So I asked her, how'd you do it? And she said, oh, we find a VPN,
yes,
virtual private network,
yep,
and then we can go on Gmail and contact you. So if even in China, ruled by one-party communist dictatorship, they're able to do that, who is going to be able to impose one view on the world? Not happening.
Okay, on to politics a little bit. And I think it was interesting to hear you speak, how impressed you are with the way the Prime Minister has done his social media campaign. So I have a question which you answered here already, but I don't think the answer is complete. So, and this is a question I got asked a lot by the people in the forum here to ask you. So I'm going to ask that anyway.
This is about one of your articles, something that you tweeted. It says, "Very well said, nice article, sir. I must say you please quit Congress. They don't deserve you. Join #BJP.
Actually, I think the Congress in many ways represents the mainstream nationalism that I write about in this book.
So, I mean, somewhere I felt that was, you didn't really answer the question because you moved on to the book. But I got a very forceful, I got about 6 members from the ICF who said, listen, you've got such great talent. Shouldn't you be in the winning party? Shouldn't you be doing something for India now, being part of the winning party rather than being what seems to be an obviously losing party? And that 2019, there's no hope in hell. Why don't you just be part of the BJP?
Because that would be called opportunism, wouldn't it? No, look, it's a question, by the way, that I genuinely get every single day. You can just go on my Twitter feed, for example, or Facebook feed at random any single day of the week. There'll be at least one person, usually 40, saying something like, you're the right man in the wrong party, quote unquote. And initially I was flattered, and then I realized that this is far too sort of easy a thing to say. I thought that when I came into politics, I had to really think through the values that I wanted to defend and promote in our politics. Obviously, I want to serve India. I want to project India to the world. International affairs is one of my strengths. I also want to help solve many of the problems with which India is still afflicted, and Indians are still suffering. There's a lot that I want to do in politics, and you can certainly construct a case that since the only way you can do that is by being in government, why don't you just join whoever is ruling? Except that, as I said, that would be terribly opportunistic, because it would mean that the convictions that are articulated in one party suddenly cease to matter when there's a ministership dangled in front of me. And I didn't want to do that. Secondly, there are some genuine ideological differences I have with the BJP. It's also true, because before one of your objections, I've had this argument with others before the meeting, but don't you have some differences with the Congress? Yes, I do. But the question is weighing which is the more important difference. You see, many of you who've read my earlier writings, and perhaps many of you haven't, will know that I was a very strong critic of the Congress. My novel, The Great Indian Novel, is a fairly excoriating portrayal of the Congress Party's performance immediately after independence. My book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was published in 1997, but talks about the 50 years after independence, is very critical of the first 45, pretty much, and all the failures, limitations, errors, etc., conducted in the name of the Congress Party during that time. So people said they were surprised that I joined the Congress. But when I was preparing to leave the UN, there were 4 major tendencies in the country. And by the way, 3 of them came to see me and asked me if I'd joined them. One tendency was indeed that of the BJP, which had been in power till 2004. I left the UN the beginning of 2007, so end of 2006 is when I lost the race for Secretary General. And at that time, there had been a fairly effective government, but 2 things were apparent. One, that they were weighed down by a baggage of bigotry that was difficult for a liberal-minded Indian to accept. That is this Hindutva thing that had come to prominence on the back of the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation. I have no problem with people believing that Ram was born there. In fact, there is some archaeological evidence that there was a temple there. That's all up to people's beliefs. In matters of faith are perfectly all right. But the fact that they chose to do it by destroying a standing building and then by attacking people of a particular community troubled me greatly. And going on from there, I was bothered about the fact that there was such overt communal signaling in much of the political campaigning of the BJP. And of course, the 2002 Gujarat riots seemed to me to be the worst of all these tendencies which we were aware of. The second problem the BJP had was the whole India shining message. India shining, but for whom is it shining? They never seemed to ask that question. And it did seem that only a small favoured few and narrow elite were profiting from the successes of the BJP government in its first term. Then you have the communists and the left who claim to be working for the poor of India, but who will obstruct and oppose every single progressive measure that any government would want to take to overcome India's poverty, because they can only succeed as long as the poor remain poor. So that is the sort of second broad tendency. And there is a third, which is, of course, that of the regional parties. And since I have a national and global vision, a regional party would never have interested me. And that leaves me with the Congress. Now, I'm not saying that's the only choice left, but if I were to analyze the Congress positively or in detail, it would be, number one, that it was the original party of India's nationalism, but of a very inclusive nationalism, that said that everybody who's contributed to this country, its civilization, has equal rights in it, whether you're Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Parsi, doesn't matter. You all belong, and indeed people of all these faiths have been in the leadership of the Congress party. Second, it actually advocated an economics after 1991 of liberalizing the economy, promoting economic growth, and at the same time saying we must distribute the revenues, the fruits of that growth, to the poor, to those who can't afford to enjoy the benefits directly of our economic prosperity. And to my mind, that makes sense, first of all, because I think social justice is responsible economic policy, and also because if you are all good-minded capitalists who want to talk about the magic of the market cannot appeal to people who can't afford to enter the marketplace. So you really want to bring people up to a point where they can participate in the market economy, and the Congress party was doing that. And finally, of course, it didn't have any communal baggage. It truly worked with people of all communities. One could argue that it may have gone too far in recognizing group rights, sometimes over those of individual rights. And I differed a bit from the Congress in that I felt that every individual must have a right to dissent from the community's orthodoxy. So I was a ferocious critic of Rajiv Gandhi's Muslim Women's Bill, for example, after the Shah Banu case. But if I take my differences from the Congress party, they seem to me to be of a lesser order than my differences with that of the BJP. Now, the next challenge is you also need to have a party that embodies all these values and that actually effectively communicates and propagates them in order to be able to win elections. And that's the unspoken subtext of your question.
Yes.
That Mr. Modi seems to have hit the magic formula of being able to appeal to the electorate. He's a wonderful orator in Hindi. He's also got a very effective party organization, and God, he's extremely well funded. So
Where's the alternative?
The odds for anyone opposing him are obviously rather long odds. But having said that, you know, a cause doesn't become hopeless because it's a challenge. I mean, a challenge is what you must rise to. And I believe the Congress has a good, solid message, a good set of policies, a very deep bench strength of experienced leaders who have the competence to actually deal with the problems of the country. And I think we just have to tick the right boxes and get them out there in front. One of the things I often say is that we're not just offering you a choice between Mr. Modi and Mr. Rahul Gandhi. We're offering you a choice between two different styles of leadership, two sets of values, two sets of policies, and two different styles of leadership. So Mr. Modi is like this hero on a white stallion with his drawn sword who's sort of charging down saying, I'll solve all your problems, I know all the answers, I'm going to cut through the Gordian knots that are tying you down. And Rahul Gandhi says, I don't know all the answers. Maybe I don't even know all the questions. But I'm prepared to listen to you while you tell me what's bothering you, what's affecting your lives, and I will work with all these experienced, senior, knowledgeable people around me to find solutions to your problems. That's sort of the option that we have to give the country. Is the country ready for a subtle message of that nature? Perhaps not. But we have to try and make it ready through our own effective work. We have to organize our party or reorganize it from the booth committees up. We need certainly to rejuvenate it at the top. I read recently that the average age of the Congress Working Committee is 73. That's an embarrassment in today's day and age when 65% of our population is under 35. So there's a lot we need to do. And I'm amongst those who is talking to the party leadership about doing things that will help change this along.
But Dr. Tharoor, don't you think the scams that UPA was subject to in the last few years also had a huge impact in terms of denting the party somewhat irrevocably. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So some of the questions I got from this forum was that we need to ask Dr. Tharoor that in the 200 years that the British plundered, did they plunder more than the 70 years that the Indian politician plundered after independence, of which 65 years belong to the opposition party? So, I mean, these are very strong words and strong questions coming from the forum.
No, I'm glad.
And the question is it the scam and the perception that, the country has been plundered for 65 years, is that a bigger issue than the issues that you've laid out, which sounds absolutely sensible and right, but to us, some of us, it seems a little bit deeper than that and more irrevocable as an issue than that?
First of all, on the literal question, did they plunder more? No, they didn't plunder more, because if you actually look at the inflation-adjusted numbers, what the British did is far more than the worst Indian politicians put together can possibly have put in Swiss bank accounts or in flats in Dubai or whatever else they've done with it. So there, I don't think there's any comparison. Has there been dishonesty and corruption? Absolutely. I mean, I've written about this myself. It's not all 65 years. I would say that for most of the first 25, 30 years of India's independence, the country was still largely honest. That first generation of nationalist leaders, the ones who had actually suffered and gone to jail and so on and so forth, they were still idealistic. I don't think, when I hear some of the stories about leaders of that era, I don't think any of them would have been corrupt by any of our modern understandings of corruption. In fact, one of the stories I'll share with you was about Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was the man who succeeded Nehru as Prime Minister. When he was a minister of the government, he used his official car only to go to the office and back, and his family was never allowed to ride in it. One day, apparently, the car was parked outside the house. He was stuck in some cabinet meeting or whatever, and his teenage son said, "Chalo chalte hain gaadi mein." And they got their driver to take them on a chakkar to India Gate or whatever. When they came back, their father was standing on the porch. And he said, "Who allowed you to do this? This is government property, it's not mine." He asked the driver, "How many kilometers have you driven?" He calculated the official government rate per kilometer, counted out the money and gave it to the government treasury for his sons having misused a government car for a small chakkar to India Gate and back. I mean, this is that era. And obviously, there are no politicians like that today. And indeed, using government cars is considered a prerogative of office. But, even by the family. But the truth is that that era gave way from, I would say, the second half of the 70s onwards, into a much more selfish, each man for himself, how much can we make out of the system kind of thing. And it was certainly abetted by the unnecessarily restrictive controls that the government imposed, which meant that politicians, bureaucrats, and even peons could profit from the power to permit. When everything required permissions, when even carrying a file from one desk to another by a peon was potentially a marketable act, everyone started making money. And this then became, it was actually, corruption was a direct result of the politics of scarcity and of the license quota permit Raj, which at one time may have been introduced with the best of motives, but certainly had long since outlived its utility by the time I got to college in the mid-70s, and certainly, I think, can be blamed to a great extent for the corruption. Now, in 91, liberalization came and a lot of these permissions no longer were required, a lot of the controls were lifted. But people found other things that they could market, as it were. And the stakes became higher because as the economy grew, the sums of money involved were larger. And this is the sad thing. In some ways, I would almost not begrudge the corruption if the corrupt were actually doing their jobs. But there's a terrible story which I'll share with you, which some of you may have already heard, about the Indian bureaucrat and the Chinese bureaucrat. Stop me if you've all heard this. It's a fairly common story about this Indian bureaucrat who goes to an international conference and meets his Chinese counterpart. This is in a conference in Beijing and so on, and they get along very well. And the Chinese guy says, "Come to my house," and he's a member of the Communist Party. And this Indian bureaucrat goes along. and he finds this magnificent mansion, crystal chandeliers, great windows, plush carpeting, latest television set on the wall, etc. And he says to this guy, but you're a Chinese communist, and how do you manage to afford all this? And the communist Chinese smiles at him and says, come to the window. And he takes the Indian bureaucrat to the window, and he says, see that highway? And the Indian sees this big, gleaming 6-lane highway. Chinese says, 10%. And then he takes him to another room in the house and says, look out the window. He says, see that bridge? And, this Indian looks out and sees this magnificent, big, cantilevered bridge, 8 lanes spanning a huge river and so on. And the Chinese bureaucrat says, 10%. So the Indian bureaucrat's very impressed and he goes home. A few years later, or so the story goes, the Chinese bureaucrat is in India for the international conference. So he meets his old friend, the Indian. The Indian says, now you must come home. I have to return your hospitality. Please come to my house. And so the Chinese goes, and sure enough, there's this gigantic mansion, crystal chandeliers, plush carpeting, beautiful modern televisions on the wall, etc., etc. So the Chinese now turns to India and says, but you told me you live very modestly. How can you afford all this on what they tell me what you told me they were paying you? So the Indian says, no problem, come here. He says, he takes him to a window. He says, look there. He says, do you see that national highway? So the Chinese looks, and he sees nothing. He just sees a normal road. And Indian says, 100%. So that's part of the problem too, that the corruption seems to know absolutely no restraint, is unrelated to performance. And to my mind, some of these things definitely need tackling. Whether Mr. Modi's way of doing it, with demonetization and various inspections and tax terrorism and so on and so forth, is the way, only time will tell. Right now, I'm sorry to say that corruption is still rife in the country, is still widespread. I hear anecdotally from all sorts of people of having had to indulge in corrupt practices to get their own way. One thing I will say, though, of course, is that in every corrupt transaction, there is a giver as well as a taker. And if all of us chose not to give, then the corrupt would not be able to take. He said, we want some corners cut, we want some favors given, we want to win some tenders, we want to do whatever it may be, and so we will pay. And once we pay, we really lose the moral right to say that man is corrupt because you've actually participated in his corruption. So the only thing I could say is that perhaps if Anna Hazare, instead of going around with his crusade the way he had, instead simply got every one of the millions of people in his rallies and watching him on television to take a note that they would never give a bribe. Forget about taking it. There'd be no one left to take.
Coming to a slightly lighter question, because I got a question from a lady fan whose question really is, what is it in you that draws people to you? And basically, she says, maybe it's your enigma. So I thought I would straight away ask you the question, what's your view on it?
I don't have a view, because first of all, if people are drawn to me, you have to ask them why they're drawn to me. I do enjoy relating to people. I'll be honest and say that an audience brings out the best in me. I enjoy relating to people. Maybe some of that enjoyment comes across.
My last video.
Okay.
Yeah?
Great collection, by the way. Very impressed.
That's the one area where I disagree with Martin. I don't think that, in fact, China is doing well on soft power, despite assiduous efforts to promote it. Everything from the Beijing Olympics to the hundreds of Confucius centers around the world are an assiduous attempt to promote Chinese soft power. But unfortunately, soft power isn't only what governments can promote through propaganda. It's what the world sees of you as what you are. And that's why a country like India, where the government is incompetent at promoting soft power, has so much more soft power because of Bollywood films and the practice of yoga and Ayurveda and so on, which have nothing to do with the government, but which actually make India look like the attractive culture and civilization that it is.
Okay. So my question is that I believe you're one of the first diplomats to actually actively propagate soft power as a concept.
The concept was invented by an American scholar called Joseph Nye. And when I read his views, I thought this actually can be applied to India. So I wrote to him saying, this is what I intend to say. He gave me his blessings. And from about 2002 or so, 2001, 2002, I've been actively talking about soft power. And finally, I'm fortunate enough that it infected the Indian discourse, my writings and speeches, when R&AW, our intelligence agency, inaugurated a lecture series. They invited me to deliver the first one in 2006, I think it was, and I chose this theme. And the intelligence committee was quite done, but in fact, it made a lot of sense, and they told me later that they saw the merit in what I was arguing. And then around 2009 or 10, when even Dr. Manmohan Singh started using the phrase in his speeches, I thought, I've made it. Now I can relax and let the story gather its own
So my
momentum.
question is, do you think India is doing enough with the soft power? One question. Second question is, don't you think that the current government in the last couple of years has done more in this area than previous governments have? And the third question, which is kind of in some way allied to what I'm asking you, we are all Indians living in Sri Lanka. Is there any tip that you want to give us in terms of how we can help in propagating this concept and taking this forward in the context of India?
Right. Well, on soft power, remember, as I was saying there when the video got cut off, is that soft power is not about what governments can do. It really is about how people perceive you. Hard power is exercised. Soft power is evoked.
Yes.
It's when people hear the word India, what do they hear? For a while after the Nirbhaya tragedy, all they heard was sexual harassment, rape, and so on. Negative soft power.
Yeah.
When we had the 2004 election results, I was traveling in the Arab countries. And my senior Arab interlocutors, officials, ministers, and so on, were just overwhelmed with astonishment and admiration that we'd had an election which was won by a woman of Italian background and Catholic faith, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. They were totally astonished. And I said, look, this isn't about you. This is just how the way we are. That's soft power too. Or in Afghanistan, at the peak of the crisis there, we had no soldiers on the ground, but Kyonki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi was the single most popular show on Afghan television. Something like 92% of people were watching it. It became so well known as a show that it became the excuse for Afghan families who traditionally brush personal problems and family issues sort of under the carpet or under the veil to start discussing family problems because they were being portrayed on the screen. Mullah started objecting that people were missing religious functions during the hours of its broadcast. There were stories of weddings being interrupted, weddings, so that the guests could all congregate around the TV for half an hour, watch the show, and then go back to the wedding. A British news agency, Reuters, not an Indian journalist, wrote about an incident in Mazar-e-Sharif when robbers used the time of the show broadcast to strip a vehicle of every single detachable part. The hubcaps, the spokes, the windshield wipers, the side view mirrors, everything they could move, and then they scrawled on the windshield, Tulsi Zindabad. Now, the Indian taxpayer didn't have to pay for this, right? This is soft power by itself. Why? Because the chowkidars are busy watching the show rather than minding the cars. Now, if you look at all of this, then you're asking, what is the government doing or what is India doing enough about soft power? We're not doing enough, arguably, and your second question is accurate. This government has taken it up more seriously. Getting the UN to declare the International Day of Yoga was certainly a welcome step. The attempts to start these Buddhist conferences, so Buddhist countries could be reminded of India as the fount of Buddhism. All of these are interesting and clever initiatives. But none can match in impact the effect of the fact that in Britain today, Indian restaurants employ more people than the coal mining, shipbuilding, and iron and steel industries combined. So the empire has struck back through Indian food. And as we all know, the way to everybody's heart is through their palates, and Indian food has done it. So how do you compare and contrast all of this? I don't know. We could leverage our soft power a little more. These festivals of India are a beginning, but they just come and go. Your 1 week of Indian dances and movies and so on. Once people have missed it, it's over.
Sure.
What can we do to inject attractive Indian things into the lives of other countries? Yoga is now universally practiced. You can't go to a small town in America and not see yoga classes being advertised. You can't go to a small town in Europe and not see an Indian restaurant. So basically everywhere now there are aspects of India that are present in the consciousness of people. That gives us some soft power. whether we can leverage it more effectively by ensuring that the right stories are told about us, whether heartwarming stories about India can be made to go viral, for example, on global social media, not just our own. All of these things could seriously require some effort, but I'm very much in favor of trying to rely more on that, because ultimately, I don't believe that hard power is going to be the answer. Let me add one more footnote though. Soft power alone is not enough. Hard power without soft power just makes you a bully. The Chinese and Russians have discovered that. They win the hard power battle, whether it's in Ukraine for the Russians, whether it's in Tibet or with the Uyghurs for the Chinese, but they lose the soft power war. But when you look at the way in which soft power is being made a panacea, it's very unwise, because soft power without hard power is an admission of weakness. You also have to be tough.
Yeah.
And you have to be, we have this wonderful tourist campaign for incredible India. But what we need as a country, as a government, as a system, is also to come across as credible India.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is something which requires a lot more hard work on our part.
Anything in the context of Sri Lanka?
Yes, well, all of you, first of all, it's a cliche that every visiting Indian official must have said to you that you're all ambassadors for the country, but in many ways it is true, because the way in which we behave in foreign countries, people tend to judge our entire country by our own behavior. If some Indian comes and misbehaves, behaves badly, behaves cheaply, boorishly, whatever, the immediate tendency people to say all Indians are, these Indians, they behave this way. So be conscious, it seems to me, that you are not just reflecting on yourself, but you are actually setting an example that will, whether you like it or not, whether you intend to or not, will reflect on others. If you do good, if you come across well, if you're actively engaged, as the ICF seems to be in Sri Lankan society, you will inevitably spread good words about India through those actions. You misbehave, you're rude, you're insulting, or ghetto-minded, or whatever, that too will go back to them. In fact, I think that the best things you can do is to integrate, even though you may only be here for a few years posting or whatever, is to integrate as thoroughly as you can with your neighbors with Sri Lankan society by being yourselves good at what you do and pleasant to be with and live with. You are enhancing India's soft power in the world. The other thing you could do, of course, is to help spread the message and talk, maybe not too self-consciously, but talk to Sri Lankans about some of the better things in our culture, in our civilization. Highlight some of the things about us that you feel their knowing about will enhance our respect in their eyes. And these are the things that we all do consciously or unconsciously when we are abroad. You're living abroad or in a neighboring country, but still a foreign one. That's what you can do.
Great. So moving on from soft power to hard power, there is a worldview today among some people that the right wing has taken charge in many countries, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Putin, whether it's Trump, and they're even rumoring that Marine Le Pen might come to power in France. It means somewhere that the right wing is taking charge. And some historians have made this assessment that it's like pre-World War II, which resulted in a horrible world war. Is your assessment in this space, or how do you see this whole right-wing thing, and do you see any connection to World War as a historian yourself?
No, I think it's a bit exaggerated. Even the very examples you gave, Trump won the election, but Hillary won 3 million more votes. Brexit prevailed in Britain, but with immediate buyer's remorse. Now the polls are showing that the majority of Brits don't want to leave. Marine Le Pen is leading in the polls, but in the French system, there's a second round, and she'll almost certainly lose because everybody else will gather up against her. In Germany, both the candidates contesting for the chancellorship are moderate centrists. In Netherlands, Geert Wilders ran this racist right-wing campaign. He came second to a moderate. And so it goes. I think that the majority sentiment in the world is, by and large, towards the center in most countries. And we'll get there. I mean, once in a while, there are moments, and very often economic dissatisfaction contributes to this kind of thing, where people feel sometimes that, for example, in many Western countries, the perception that their jobs have been taken away and sent off to other countries is naturally something that that bothers them, and that creates a certain backlash both against the elites in their own country, who they feel have sent away these jobs, and the foreigners who they feel have come to take away their jobs or are taking them away elsewhere. So some xenophobia and some backlash against the ruling class is common to all of these protests. But how many societies have endured similar things and gone over it? I think we can. The world is better equipped in modern institutions that can cope with all of these things and that can therefore overcome them than perhaps would have been the case before the Second World War.
This is a question from a member. It says, Trump Putin, Trump Jinping, Trump Modi. Who do you think will be Jodi number 1?
My worry is Trump Modi. No, I think that Trump Putin seemed to be the most likely, except that now the whole question of Trump's Russian connections has become such a big political issue in America that I think it will rather severely circumscribe Trump's opportunities to warm up with Russia. Paradoxically, that's not so good for us, because a Trump warming up to Russia would have been a Russia detaching itself relatively from the embrace of China, and in turn would perhaps have put an end to the Russian increasing warmth towards Pakistan, which was beginning to worry some of us in Delhi, that the last thing India wants to see is sort of a Russia-China-Pakistan axis, which could seriously trouble us in our own neighborhood. So Mr. Trump looked likely to be an unwitting agent for us of breaking up the prospects of such an axis. And the fact that he is now being constrained by the developments in his own country from moving forward towards Russia could result in a sort of revival of distance between the US and Russia. There's already distance between the present US administration and China, and therefore the possibility of the two of them getting closer to each other, supporting strongly Pakistan's efforts to undermine us, and altogether therefore not being very good for us. This will have to be watched very carefully from Delhi.
Last couple of questions. How do you solve the ISIS problem? I mean, it seems like a really complex, intractable problem that's causing huge amounts of division amongst communities and amongst people, and being used a lot by politicians to further divide people.
Yes, but you know, I'm not sure the problem can be solved in the absolute sense, but it certainly can be contained. And what you're seeing with a lot of these terrorist movements is through a combination of effective intelligence, proactive arrests, and sometimes some borderline illegal means like drone attacks on unarmed people and so on, you are able to make severe dents. Al-Qaeda was a big threat after 9/11. Where is Al-Qaeda today? You hardly hear about it. Maybe one incident every year and a half or something may happen, but they're no longer a major threat. They still exist, but they have been curbed and contained. ISIS now is the major threat, but they're losing in Mosul. They've surrendered a lot of territory in Syria. They've surrendered some territory in Iraq. And my perception is that ISIS too will eventually be defeated. It's a matter of time before they get Baghdadi. And once they've done that, there'll still be some of these elements around, but their capacity to wreak global havoc will be considerably less. But then something else will come up. I mean, there is essentially a strain of fundamental, almost existential discontent in the Arab world that you can keep suppressing. But occasionally, it's like, you put the lid of the pressure cooker, you'll screw it tight, but once in a while the valve will pop and there'll be steam coming out. That is inevitable, and it's going to, I think, be a phenomenon that all of us and our children will have to live with. I don't see it disappearing overnight. So solved is not a word I would use, but contained, restricted until the next version of it comes up, I'm afraid. That
so it's
seems
something,
to be the...
So we don't need to move to a different planet, you think? I mean,
None of them. I mean, ISIS went through a brief period of less than a year when they grew and expanded and took over territory, captured cities, became seemingly irresistible. And now for the last year and a half, 2 years, it's been completely the other way. They're shrinking, they're narrowing, they're losing, etc. So, but the fact is that in the end, does it matter? I mean, if you happen to be going to an airport to catch a flight, and some crazy guy who may or may not have got his orders from ISIS, but has been inspired by all of these terrorists, blows himself up in front of you and kills you, then it doesn't matter to you whether ISIS has been solved or not.
Sure.
This train, this dangerous, radical, Islamist sort of thinking is, I'm afraid, something that the world will permanently have to live with for the foreseeable future.
So, Dr. Tharoor, a person who wears India on his sleeve,
Yes, quite
right
literally.
now you got it like a pin, I think.
Yeah.
A prolific speaker, prolific writer, inspiring person on Twitter. You've got all the ingredients it takes to be an alternative as a prime ministerial candidate.
Oh,
I mean, have you ever thought about it? And so I can see a great response from here as well. So, I mean, have you thought, because the country genuinely thinks, and I think people believe that an alternative is needed. Do you see yourself as an alternative at some point?
to be honest, that's not the way our politics works. You know that. I mean, in our system, in the parliamentary system, a party has to get a majority. The parties have their own settled leadership structures. We know what the leadership structure of my
party is. But if you look at our
is.
current prime minister, sorry to interject, but if you look at our current prime minister, I don't know whether it's a party which is one, or whether it's the individual who's actually, like you rightly said, a stallion sitting with a sword drawn, taking on leadership. You kind of contrast that versus the previous leadership perceived as not being, gallant enough to lead from the front, perceived. But I'm saying that in a sense, it kind of shows that somebody with a strong personality can actually come and provide an alternative.
Yeah, well, look, I think in our country, clearly the mood of the times at the moment is for some sort of quote-unquote strong leadership.
Yes.
And the kind of alternative style of leadership that I recommended to all of you, which is in fact the leadership we are offering right now, is apparently not necessarily what people are looking for. At least they have been persuaded by the Modi approach so far. But on the other hand, there are some practical realities to be taken into account. For example, performance. It's interesting that in the last 5 assembly elections, everyone focused on the BJP's victory in UP. But the BJP was in power in 2 states of those 5, and they lost both. They lost Punjab, they de facto lost Goa. Yes, they cobbled together a coalition with parties that were hostile to them earlier, but they went from a majority of seats in the 40-member assembly to just 13 seats in Goa. So clearly the fact is that if people don't perform as they promise, the voters will turn against them. And, I'm wondering whether those young people in UP who voted for Mr. Modi, because in 2014 he said, I'm going to bring 2 crore jobs to this country, and you will have jobs. And they don't have jobs, because in fact, according to the government's own figures, in the last fiscal year, the government produced exactly 1.34 lakh jobs. 2 crores is 200 lakhs. So where is 200 lakhs, where's 1.34 lakhs? There's no comparison in terms of the need, the demand, the expectation, and the actual delivery. So perhaps the young man who voted 5 years ago expecting a job and still doesn't have one may not vote for Mr. Modi again. So there is an opportunity to give this alternative a fair chance. I don't think I personally have a chance in the system to put forward any individual claims, but I'm certainly happy to be part of this effort to communicate a credible message and a collegial style of governance, and at the same time to offer a vision that is knowledgeable, that is qualified, that is capable, and that can help take India forward, undoubtedly in a different way from Mr. Modi's, but certainly in a way that will benefit the vast millions of our country who need effective governance.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for an absolutely fantastic session.
Thank you.